My ex spread lies that I was broke. After I funded her college degree, so I bought the company she works for and became her boss. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I thought love meant giving everything I had. From the moment I met Chloe, there was something magnetic about her, a spark that drew everyone in, but somehow made me feel like I was the only one she saw. She was ambitious, sharp, and from a modest, middle-class background, and I admired that about her. College had always been her dream, but her family couldn't fully support her, and seeing that made me want to help. I convinced myself it wasn't just financial aid, it was an investment in our shared future, a way to build a life together while she chased her goals. I remember the first semester I helped pay her tuition. The campus bookstore smelled like fresh ink and cheap coffee, and I'd hand her checks with a sense of pride, watching her eyes light up as she hugged me. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she'd say, her voice soft and affectionate. I brushed off the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, she was enjoying the luxury more than the ambition. I covered rent, groceries, and even helped fund internships that were unpaid but crucial for her career. I worked extra shifts late into the night, typing spreadsheets and debugging software, knowing that every penny I earned went into building what I thought was a life together. Sometimes I noticed little things. The casual mentions of designer handbags she wanted to treat herself to, the envious glances at classmates with nicer apartments. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I wanted to be the supportive partner, the one who would help her rise without complaint. Every time she smiled at me, clutching a textbook or a coffee, I felt this swell of pride, thinking, this is us. We're building our future. Looking back, I wish I'd noticed the subtle signs of entitlement creeping into her charm. But at the time, all I felt was love and purpose. I was convinced that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, was paving the way for something beautiful. I had no idea that beneath her sweet words, Chloe was starting to resent the very foundation I was building for us. And yet, I didn't see it coming. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but somewhere between her graduation and her first real job, Chloe began to change. At first, it was subtle. Little comments about how tight I was with money, or sighs when I suggested we stick to my modest budget for groceries. I brushed them off as stress, thinking she was adjusting to the adult world and the pressures of a new career. But slowly, those small remarks became sharper, tinged with impatience or amusement at my careful planning. One evening, as I handed her a check for her rent, she smirked and said, "You really think that's going to cover everything?" I felt a twinge of embarrassment, but laughed it off, masking the sting. Chloe's ambitions had always been admirable, but now they came wrapped in an almost insatiable appetite for luxury. She started showing up in clothes and shoes that were far beyond what I could reasonably afford, casually mentioning how her friends had weekend trips planned to fancy cities or wine tastings at vineyards. "We should go," she'd say, eyes bright, assuming I'd make it happen. And every time, I found myself stretching, taking on extra shifts, skipping nights out with friends, convincing myself that this was just part of supporting the woman I loved. Deep down, though, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the same Chloe I had fallen for. The tension between us grew quietly but relentlessly. I began noticing subtle, almost imperceptible signs. Her friends questioning why she seemed to live so well on a boyfriend who worked 2 jobs. Her stories about me being so responsible but not exactly wealthy. And the way she'd casually mention classmates whose parents could actually afford them nice things. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was harmless bragging, that it didn't matter as long as we were building a life together. But each night, as I fell asleep at my desk after hours of overtime, watching my savings dwindle while hers seemed to expand effortlessly, I felt a quiet frustration creeping in. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe's admiration for me was slowly being replaced by something else, something I wasn't yet ready to name. And I didn't know it then, but the seeds of betrayal were already being sown. I never saw it coming. One afternoon, Chloe called me, sounding almost cheerful, but there was this edge in her voice that I couldn't place. "We need to talk," she said, and I immediately felt a pit form in my stomach. I figured it was just a fight about money or schedules, maybe the little arguments we'd brushed off for months. But the moment she sat down across from me, her eyes cold and distant, I realized this was something else entirely. "I can't do this anymore," she said, and my chest tightened. "You're nice, and I know you've done a lot for me, but I can't be with someone who's so limited. Financially, I mean." Her words hit me like a punch I hadn't seen coming. I blinked, searching for some joke, some softening, but there was nothing. "What are you saying?" I stammered. "You're breaking up with me because of money?" She nodded, like it was the most logical thing in the world. "It's not just that," she continued, her tone almost smug now. "People are saying you're barely keeping up. I can't be with someone who can't give me the life I deserve." I sat there, frozen, as the reality sank in. The money I had sacrificed, the nights I spent working until my eyes burned, the savings I had painstakingly built to fund her dreams, it was all gone, twisted into some kind of weakness in her mind. "I, you know, did everything for us," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But Chloe just shook her head and smiled, a cold, practiced little smile. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I have to move on." The aftermath was worse than the breakup itself. Friends and acquaintances started repeating her version of the story. I was broke, irresponsible, and unable to support someone ambitious. It spread faster than I could stop it, leaving me humiliated and isolated. I remember sitting on my couch late at night, the apartment too quiet, my hands shaking as I scrolled through messages from people I trusted, now questioning me. And yet, as I sat there staring at the ceiling, anger slowly began to bubble under the hurt. I realized that I couldn't just let this go. There was something I needed to do, though I didn't yet know what. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For weeks after the breakup, I wandered through my apartment in a daze, replaying every conversation, every little detail of what I had done for Chloe. I felt exposed, like my kindness had been weaponized against me, and the humiliation gnawed at my confidence. Friends tried to console me, but most of them had already heard her version of events, that I was broke, unreliable, and incapable of providing even the basics. Every text, every casual mention of me in passing, seemed like another dagger twisting in my gut. I couldn't believe the person I had poured my life into had spun such a narrative, and worse, that the world was starting to believe it. Anger began to replace the initial shock. At first, I thought about confronting her, but I knew that would just feed into her story. Public arguments would only make me look weaker, play into the broke and desperate image she had crafted. So, instead, I turned inward, thinking strategically. I knew I couldn't undo the humiliation, but maybe I could regain control in a way that mattered, something permanent, something she couldn't manipulate or spin. That's when I started researching her career. Chloe had landed a mid-level management role at a small but growing company. At first, it was curiosity, almost casual. Who she worked for, what the company's structure was, whether there was room for growth. But the more I looked, the more an idea started to form. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my power. I could see opportunities where the company was undervalued, where a strategic acquisition could place me in a position of authority. Every late night, I pored over financial statements and market trends, sketching out possibilities in notebooks that smelled of coffee and printer ink. I imagined stepping into that company not as an outsider, but as someone who could command respect, someone who could turn the tables on Chloe without a word. It was risky, maybe even insane, but the thought made my chest tighten in anticipation, a mix of fear and exhilaration. By the time dawn broke over the city skyline, I had a plan forming in my mind, sharp and precise. I knew it would take time, money, and relentless effort. But I also knew one thing. Chloe had underestimated me, and I was about to prove that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. And yet, even as I plotted quietly, I had no idea just how close she was to discovering the storm I was quietly building. Over the next few months, I threw myself into the plan with a single-minded intensity I hadn't felt in years. Every spare hour went into research, networking, and learning the nuances of business acquisitions. I read everything I could get my hands on about mergers, company valuations, and shareholder negotiations. Nights blurred into mornings as I pored over spreadsheets, financial statements, and market trends, my apartment littered with coffee cups and crumpled notes. I was exhausted, sure, but each step forward fueled a strange, burning sense of purpose. The anger I'd carried since Chloe's betrayal became a motivator, pushing me past doubt, past fatigue, past the fear that I was overreaching. The first hurdle was finding investors willing to back me. I scheduled meeting after meeting, walking into boardrooms where people looked me up and down skeptically. "You don't have a portfolio like this," one investor said, barely hiding a smirk. "Why should I risk my money on a personal vendetta?" I smiled, almost coldly, and said, "Because the opportunity is real, and I'm willing to make it work." Their doubt only hardened my resolve. Every rejection, every skeptical glance, reminded me of Chloe's smirk when she'd called me broke. I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted to create an undeniable proof that she had misjudged me. At the same time, I kept tabs on Chloe's progress at her company. Her charm and ambition were obvious. Colleagues praised her as indispensable, unaware that her past manipulation had shaped my life. The thought made my resolve harden. I couldn't just buy my way into the company. I had to be smart, subtle, deliberate. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about building leverage, creating a reality where the tables were fully turned. Finally, after months of meticulous planning, research, and sleepless nights, I secured enough capital to make the first moves toward acquiring a controlling stake in her company. My heart raced as I signed documents, each pen stroke a silent promise that the story was about to shift in a way she'd never anticipate. And just as the last signature dried, I realized something chilling. I was closer than ever to her, and yet, she remained completely unaware of the storm heading straight for her world. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived, but reality hit harder than I expected. Chloe wasn't the obstacle I thought she would be. She was far more entrenched and influential in her company than I'd realized. Meeting with some of the senior staff, I quickly learned how highly she was regarded. The kind of praise that made her sound indispensable. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. This wasn't going to be a simple acquisition, where I stepped in, and she crumbled under the weight of her own lies. She had built her reputation meticulously, and I would need to be precise, patient, and strategic. Sitting in my apartment that night, I could feel my chest tightening, a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. I had the resources, the knowledge, and the plan. But now I realized that just buying the company wouldn't be enough. Chloe had to be completely unaware until the moment the power shifted, or else the thrill of seeing her humbled would be diminished. I spent hours poring over corporate bylaws, shareholder agreements, and legal loopholes. Every possibility, every contingency I accounted for, because I knew Chloe would notice the tiniest oversight. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. A casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance revealed Chloe had been talking about me in glowing terms at work. She bragged, without realizing, about my generosity during college, casting herself as the smart, ambitious woman who had made the most of my support. The irony hit me like a punch to the gut. She was admired professionally, and her reputation was untouchable to anyone who didn't know the whole truth. Suddenly, my plan needed more finesse. This wasn't just about money or control. It was about timing, perception, and subtle manipulation. Late nights blurred as I adjusted my strategy. I drafted proposals, restructured financial offers, and rehearsed how to approach the board without revealing my personal motives. The adrenaline and anticipation were intoxicating. Each step brought me closer to the ultimate showdown, but also reminded me that the stakes had risen. And as I prepared to make my move, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Chloe's own cunning might surprise me. Turning the table could be far more complex than I ever imagined. The day I finalized the acquisition is still burned into my memory. I walked into the office, briefcase in hand, heart hammering, knowing that everything was about to change. The paperwork was signed, the shares transferred, and just like that, I was the majority stakeholder. Chloe had no idea. She was in her office, typing away at reports, completely unaware that the world she thought she controlled had quietly shifted beneath her. I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and calm as I stepped into the boardroom, nodding politely to the staff, who now looked at me with curiosity instead of familiarity. When I first addressed Chloe directly, it was with careful restraint. "Morning, Chloe," I said, my tone casual, almost neutral. She looked up, startled. "Oh, hey," she stammered, eyebrows knitting together, as if sensing something was off. I didn't smirk, didn't gloat. I let the silence hang. That pause was enough. The realization dawned slowly in her eyes. The power dynamic had shifted. I wasn't some boyfriend who had given everything while she took it for granted. I was now her superior, the one in control of her career trajectory. It was intoxicating, but I knew restraint was key. Subtlety became my weapon. I introduced small operational changes, minor but noticeable, which gradually shifted her responsibilities and influence without outright confrontation. Every report she submitted now passed under my scrutiny, every decision subtly guided by my oversight. The tension was electric. I could see her adjusting, a flicker of unease in the confident composure she usually wore like armor. Colleagues started to notice too. Whispers, subtle glances, questions about new procedures. All signs that Chloe was losing the effortless sway she once held over the office. Yet I kept my tone calm, my demeanor professional, making it clear that everything happening was legitimate, structured, and justifiable. And as I left the office that evening, watching Chloe linger over her computer with a subtle furrow in her brow, I felt the first true taste of vindication. But even in that moment, I knew that the biggest tests, the confrontations, the emotional stakes, the real unraveling, were still ahead. The game had begun, and the next moves would define everything. Over the next few weeks, I started implementing small but deliberate changes in the company. Policies that had been lax before suddenly required stricter oversight. Deadlines I once turned a blind eye to were now enforced rigorously. I didn't want to humiliate Chloe, at least, not overtly. But I did want her to feel the consequences of underestimating me. Every task she submitted was scrutinized, every report carefully analyzed, and I watched as her confident composure began to crack ever so slightly. The office atmosphere shifted subtly. Colleagues who had always admired her now exchanged quiet glances, noticing the changes in workflow and Chloe's growing anxiety. The first time I confronted her directly about a missed deadline, it was under the guise of professionalism. "Chloe, I noticed the Henderson report was submitted late," I said calmly, watching her face tighten. "We need to adhere to the new standards moving forward. I'm counting on you." She blinked, caught off guard, and murmured, "Of course. Sorry. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The small slip wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of her unraveling, and I silently savored it without letting my satisfaction show. What struck me the most, though, was how much I had changed in the process. The anger that had fueled me through the acquisition had morphed into something sharper, a precise, calculating patience. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was orchestrating. Every move was strategic, every interaction measured. I was proving to myself that I could rise above humiliation, turning betrayal into empowerment. Even as Chloe adjusted to the new demands, her frustration was palpable. I'd catch her muttering under her breath, or stealing glances at me with a flicker of panic she couldn't fully hide. It was a slow burn, but the transformation was undeniable. She was beginning to realize that her lies and manipulations had consequences, real ones. And yet, even as I watched her stumble through the tightening grip of accountability, I knew this was only the beginning. The moment that would truly test her, and me, was still on the horizon, waiting to erupt. It happened sooner than I expected. One Friday afternoon, Chloe made a bold move. She tried to undermine a critical project I was overseeing, presenting half-baked numbers to a client in an attempt to make herself look indispensable while subtly discrediting my authority. I caught it almost immediately, reviewing her presentation with a growing sense of disbelief. And, honestly, a flash of rage. How could someone I had once trusted, someone I had helped rise, risk everything to manipulate a situation for personal gain? I remember standing in the conference room, paper spread across the table, heart pounding as I looked at her. "Chloe, this doesn't add up. Are you sure these numbers are correct?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, neutral. But every word carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Her eyes darted to mine, a mix of panic and defiance. I thought this would speed things along," she stammered, her voice trembling despite her attempt to appear confident. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension sit between us. It was the kind of pause that screams louder than accusations, and I watched as the realization slowly sank in. The tables had turned completely. The aftermath of that meeting was worse than I could have anticipated. Chloe tried to cover her tracks, but the ripple effect spread fast. Colleagues whispered, questions were raised, and her credibility began to erode almost instantly. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected, a hollow emptiness mixed with satisfaction. I had achieved the control I sought, but it was bittersweet. The victory was intoxicating, yet the thought of how low she had fallen, and how far this betrayal had taken me to get here, made my chest tighten. I went home that night exhausted, staring at the ceiling, the city lights flickering through my apartment window. I realized I had been consumed by this pursuit, and even though Chloe was finally facing consequences, the journey had taken a toll I hadn't fully acknowledged. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew the confrontation that would truly define the endgame, the one where everything comes to a head, was still ahead. The real reckoning was coming, and I had to be ready. The day of the confrontation arrived quietly, almost unassumingly, but I knew it would change everything. I asked Chloe to meet me in my office under the pretense of reviewing her performance, keeping my tone neutral, professional. She walked in, clipboard in hand, eyes wary but masking curiosity. "Morning," I said casually, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She hesitated before sitting, a flicker of unease crossing her usually composed face. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the tension build before speaking. "Chloe, we need to talk about everything," I began, carefully controlling my voice so it was calm but firm. Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see her trying to mask panic. I know what you said about me, about my finances, about how I supposedly couldn't provide for you. I know what you told people, I continued, letting each word land with precision. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. That's not what I meant, she started, but I raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. I laid out the facts methodically, the support I had given her in college, the sacrifices I had made, and the way she had twisted those actions into lies to make me appear weak. I watched her face pale, the confident armor she usually wore starting to crack. And now, I said, leaning back slightly, you're working under me. Your influence here isn't gone, but it's controlled. Your decisions are visible. Every misstep is accounted for. Every move you make is now part of a system I oversee. She swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw real fear. You bought the company? She whispered, voice trembling. I nodded slowly, maintaining calm composure. I did, and every choice you make now has consequences. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the city outside. I could see the realization settling in, the shock, the humiliation, but also the first flicker of respect, begrudging or not, that she hadn't anticipated. And as she sat there, frozen in disbelief, I realized this was the pinnacle of everything I had worked for. But the story wasn't over. The real challenge now was seeing how she would respond to the full weight of her actions. After that meeting, the office atmosphere shifted completely. Chloe moved through her day with a newfound caution, her usual confidence replaced by careful calculation. I could see her biting her lip, double-checking every report, and even hesitating before speaking in meetings. The subtle whispers from colleagues grew louder, and it was clear that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation. Every glance she gave me was now measured, filled with that mix of fear, frustration, and the faintest hint of respect. I spent nights reflecting on everything that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, and the months of planning that had brought me here. It was intoxicating to see her humbled, but I realized that the real satisfaction wasn't just in watching her stumble. It was in knowing that I had reclaimed my power, rebuilt my life, and transformed betrayal into something I could control. I had become someone capable of defending myself and asserting authority without losing my integrity in the process. Chloe eventually approached me, hesitantly, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I didn't realize how much I underestimated you, she admitted, eyes avoiding mine. I nodded, letting the moment linger. You've learned now, I said, my tone calm, almost gentle. I hope it teaches you something about respect and honesty. She nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of her mistakes settling visibly on her shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure creeping in. I wasn't just vindicated. I was free from the lingering doubts and anger that had consumed me after the breakup. Chloe's downfall had been a catalyst, but the true reward was the empowerment I had found within myself. I realized that revenge wasn't just about seeing someone else fail. It was about proving to yourself that you can rise above. And as I looked around the office that evening, watching Chloe quietly comply with the new structure, I knew the hardest part was over. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that one final challenge, whether in business or in the remnants of our personal history, was still waiting, just around the corner. Weeks passed, and the company settled into its new rhythm. Chloe had adapted, begrudgingly, but there was a subtle shift in every interaction. She was no longer the center of attention, no longer the untouchable figure she once believed herself to be. Her pride had been dented, but more importantly, I felt something I hadn't expected, a quiet sense of peace. For the first time since the breakup, I wasn't defined by anger, humiliation, or her lies. I had turned betrayal into empowerment, and that realization brought a calm I hadn't known I could feel. I began focusing on growth, mentoring employees, making strategic decisions, and even finding enjoyment in the day-to-day operations of the company. Chloe remained part of the team, but now, under my oversight. The subtle tension persisted, sure, but it was a tension I could control, and one that reminded me of the lessons learned. I wasn't out for humiliation anymore. I was out for mastery, of my life, my career, and my emotions. Occasionally, I'd catch Chloe glancing at me across the office, a flicker of respect in her eyes, though she'd never admit it aloud. And I realized that this was the ultimate payoff. Revenge had been satisfying, but empowerment, quiet, unshakable, and undeniable, was the true triumph. I had become the person she underestimated, and in doing so, I had rewritten my own story. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by my window, city lights reflecting off the glass, and think about how far I had come. The heartbreak, the lies, the humiliation. They were all part of a journey that led me to a place I couldn't have imagined in my darkest moments. I had turned pain into power and betrayal into a lesson that no one could take from me. And as I closed my laptop, preparing to leave the office for the night, I whispered to myself, the best revenge isn't ruin. It's becoming the person they never saw coming. For the first time, I truly believed it, and it felt like freedom.